My sister humiliated my son in front of everyone, yelling, "You are just a spoiled brat, not special." The next day, she called CPS and tried to have him taken from me. But she had no idea what I was about to do next. I, 38 male, never thought I would be the kind of person to meticulously plot the absolute destruction of my own flesh and blood. I always believed that family was sacred, that you forgave transgressions, and that you kept the peace for the sake of the older generation. But when someone comes for your child, every rule you have ever lived by burns to ash. To understand the magnitude of what I did, you have to understand the inciting incident. It happened 3 months ago, during a weekend barbecue I was hosting at my house. My entire family was there, including our parents, several cousins, and my older sister. My sister had always been the golden child growing up. She married wealth, lived in a gated community, and projected an image of flawless, affluent perfection. She also had a deep, simmering resentment for anyone who pulled the spotlight away from her. My son, who is 9, is on the autism spectrum. He struggles with loud noises and crowds, but he has a brilliant, analytical mind. He had recently won a regional robotics competition, a massive achievement for him, considering his social anxieties. He was sitting on the patio, excitedly explaining the mechanics of his robot to our parents. He was animated, happy, and entirely in his element. Our parents were beaming, hanging on his every word and praising his intelligence. I was at the grill when I noticed my sister storming over to the patio. Her face was contorted with an ugly kind of rage. I started walking toward them, but I was too late. Without any provocation, she interrupted my son's explanation and began screaming at him. She aggressively told him that he was monopolizing everyone's time. She yelled the exact words that he was just a spoiled brat, that he was not special, and that everyone was only pretending to care about his stupid toys because they felt sorry for him. The silence that fell over the backyard was deafening. My son froze, his eyes wide with absolute terror, before he dropped his robotics trophy on the concrete and bolted inside the house, sobbing hysterically. I saw red. I dropped the tongs, marched over to my sister, and demanded that she leave my property immediately. She tried to justify her outburst, claiming she was just giving him a reality check and that I was coddling him. I refused to listen to a single word. I stepped into her personal space, pointed at the gate, and told her that if she did not walk out right that second, I would physically throw her over the fence. Her husband hurried over, looking embarrassed, and grabbed her arm. My sister scoffed, adjusted her expensive cardigan, and told me I was overreacting, before marching out to their car. I spent the rest of the evening consoling my son. I assured him over and over that his aunt was wrong, that his mind was beautiful, and that we were all incredibly proud of him. Eventually he calmed down, but the light in his eyes was gone for the night. Our parents apologized profusely for her behavior, but the damage was done. I thought that would be the end of it. I planned to go no contact with her and move on with my life. I had no idea she was just getting started. The very next morning, a Sunday, there was a heavy knock on my front door. I opened it to find 2 strangers standing on my porch, displaying state badges. They introduced themselves as social workers from Child Protective Services. My heart completely stopped. The lead worker explained that they had received an urgent, anonymous tip late Saturday night. The caller had reported severe emotional and physical abuse in my home. The allegations were horrifying. The worker stated that the caller claimed I frequently locked my son in a dark closet for hours, withheld food as punishment for his autistic traits, and created a deeply volatile and unsafe environment. I felt physically sick. I invited them inside, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen door. I explained that my son was autistic, that he had just won a major award, and that we had hosted a family party the day before. I told them about my sister's outburst. The social workers maintained blank, professional expressions. They asked to inspect my home. I showed them my son's room, which was filled with his favorite books, his robotics kits, and his weighted blankets. I opened my pantry and my refrigerator to show them we had plenty of food. Then came the worst part. They informed me that they needed to interview my son privately. I had to wake him up and explain that these strangers needed to ask him some questions. I watched from the hallway as they sat with him in the living room. The sheer terror of knowing that the state had the power to remove my child based on a malicious lie paralyzed me. After 30 agonizing minutes, the workers came out. They noted that my son appeared healthy, bonded to me, and deeply confused by their questions. They explained that they would leave the case open pending a final review, but that they did not see any immediate signs of danger. After they left, I sat on my kitchen floor and cried. But the tears of fear quickly evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. The anonymous tip was too specific. The caller knew about my son's diagnosis, knew my address, and knew exactly what buzzwords to use to trigger an immediate emergency response. She was so vindictive about being kicked out of a barbecue that she tried to have my child taken away by the state. I realized then that simply cutting her off wasn't enough. She was a dangerous, unhinged person hiding behind a veil of suburban perfection. If she was willing to destroy a child's life over a perceived slight, she was capable of anything. I decided I was going to find out exactly what was hiding behind her perfect facade, and I was going to tear it down. Update 1. It took 2 excruciating weeks for the official letter from CPS to arrive, stating that the allegations were entirely unfounded and the case was closed. During those 2 weeks, I barely slept. I funneled every ounce of my anxiety and rage into investigating my sister. I knew she lived completely above her means. Her husband was a moderately successful regional manager, but they lived in a multi-million-dollar home, drove luxury European cars, and took extravagant international vacations twice a year. My sister didn't work. She claimed to manage a private philanthropic foundation, constantly posting pictures of charity galas and fundraising dinners. I reached out to an old college roommate, who now worked as a forensic accountant. We met for drinks, and I laid everything out for him. I told him about the CPS visit, the terror she inflicted on my son, and my deep suspicion that her finances were a house of cards. I asked him if he could look into her public records, her charity filings, and anything else he could legally access. He saw the desperation in my eyes, and agreed to dig into the public tax documents and corporate registrations associated with her name. 3 days later, my friend called me and asked me to come to his office immediately. When I sat down across from him, he looked grim. He explained that my sister's charity was completely fraudulent. He walked me through the public tax filings, pointing out that the foundation claimed massive administrative expenses while distributing virtually zero funds to actual charitable causes. But that wasn't the worst part. He showed me the initial funding sources for the charity. There were massive, sequential cash injections made over the past 4 years. I looked at the names attached to the routing origins. It was our parents. My friend explained that it looked like a classic case of elder financial abuse. The foundation was essentially a shell company. My sister was moving money from our parents' retirement accounts into the charity, classifying it as donations, and then paying herself an exorbitant salary as the foundation's director. She was bleeding our parents dry to fund her lifestyle. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Our parents were in their late 70s. They had worked their entire lives to build a comfortable nest egg, and they lived very frugally. I knew they had given my sister power of attorney a few years ago when our father had a mild stroke, just in case of medical emergencies. She had weaponized that trust to steal their life savings. I thanked my friend and asked him to compile every single piece of evidence into a hard-copy dossier. I then contacted a lawyer who specialized in elder law and fraud. I spent an hour on the phone with him, explaining the situation and detailing the evidence my friend had uncovered. The lawyer confirmed that this was severe felony fraud and elder abuse. He advised me on the exact steps I needed to take to freeze the accounts and hand the evidence over to the authorities. I had her. She tried to take my son from my home, so I was going to take her home, her freedom, and her reputation. Update 2. The next phase required immense patience and acting skills I didn't know I possessed. I had to secure our parents' finances without alerting my sister. I visited my parents under the guise of helping them set up a new smart television. While I was there, I gently brought up their finances. I asked if they had checked their retirement balances recently, mentioning the volatile market. My father chuckled and said my sister handled all of that now, assuring me that she sent them quarterly updates, showing their investments were growing beautifully. I asked if I could see one of those updates, just out of curiosity. My mother happily retrieved a folder from their home office. I looked at the printed statements. They were completely fabricated. The letterhead was slightly off, the font was wrong, and the balances reflected hundreds of thousands of dollars that I knew, thanks to my accountant friend, were completely gone. I fought the urge to break down right there. Instead, I carefully photographed the fake statements with my phone while my parents were making coffee. I took my parents out to breakfast. I knew I couldn't sugarcoat it. Once we were seated in a quiet booth, I told them I loved them and needed them to brace themselves for some terrible news. I pulled out the real bank statements my friend had legally sourced, alongside the fake statements they had given me. I explained step by step what my sister had been doing. I showed them the transfers from their accounts to the Shell charity. I showed them the charity's tax filings, proving the money was going directly to my sister's personal salary and expenses. The denial was immediate and heartbreaking. My mother started crying, insisting there was a mistake, that her daughter would never do this. My father was angry, but his anger was directed at me for making such vile accusations. I stayed calm. I told them I understood their reaction, but the numbers did not lie. I begged them to call their bank manager right then and there on speakerphone to verify the current balances. My father, his hands shaking, made the call. He gave the bank representative his security details and asked for the exact balance of his primary retirement account. The representative stated a number that was less than 10% of what my father believed he had. The color drained from my father's face. The phone slipped from his hand and clattered onto the table. My mother buried her face in her hands and began to sob uncontrollably. The reality of their golden child's betrayal crashed down on them. I spent the rest of the day with them at the bank, legally revoking my sister's power of attorney and freezing every single account they had. We then went straight to my lawyer's office to draft the affidavits required for the police. I told my parents that I would handle the confrontation. I needed to look her in the eye when her world collapsed. I instructed them to go home, lock their doors, and not answer any calls or texts from her. It was time to spring the trap. Update 3. I orchestrated the confrontation meticulously. I wanted an audience. She had humiliated my son in front of everyone, so she was going to be exposed in the exact same manner. I sent out a group text to my sister, her husband, and a few key extended family members who live nearby. I framed it as an emergency family meeting regarding our parents' declining health. I knew my sister wouldn't miss it. She had to maintain her facade as the caring, responsible daughter who was in charge of their care. They arrived at my house on a Friday evening. My sister walked in looking incredibly inconvenienced, wearing designer clothes paid for by our parents' stolen future. Her husband looked tired, trailing behind her. The extended family members looked deeply concerned. Our parents were not there. I had arranged for them to stay at a hotel for the night, to spare them the emotional trauma of the actual confrontation. I directed everyone to the living room and asked them to sit down. My sister immediately took control, asking where our parents were, and demanding to know what medical emergency required dragging her away from her busy schedule. She complained that she had a charity gala to plan and couldn't be wasting time. I stood in the center of the room. I picked up a thick stack of manila folders from the coffee table. I handed one to her husband, one to my aunt, and one to my uncle. I kept the last one for myself. My sister crossed her arms and asked what the dramatic presentation was about. I looked directly at her and stated that there was no medical emergency. I explained that the meeting was actually about her finances. Her smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, quickly replaced by indignation. She demanded to know what business I had discussing her finances. Instead of answering her, I turned to her husband. I asked him to open the folder. I instructed him to look at the first document, which was the official tax filing for his wife's philanthropic foundation. I asked him to read the total amount of charitable distributions out loud. He looked confused, but he read the number. It was 0. I then asked him to turn to the next page and read the director's salary and administrative expenses, his voice cracking as he recited a figure in the high 6 digits. He looked up at my sister, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He asked her what this meant. My sister jumped up. Her face flushed red. She started screaming that I was invading her privacy, that these documents were forged, and that she and her husband were leaving. I stepped between her and the door. I told her husband to keep reading. I instructed him to look at the bank transfer logs on the 3rd page. The room was dead silent as he flipped the page. I watched his eyes scan the lines. I explained to the room that those transfers represented our parents' entire life savings, being funneled directly into his wife's fake charity over the last 4 years. I stated clearly that she had stolen nearly $1 million from the people who raised her, to buy her cars, her clothes, and her vacations. My aunt gasped loudly. My uncle dropped the folder on the floor. Her husband stood up slowly. He looked at my sister as if he was seeing a stranger. He asked her, his voice trembling, if it was true. My sister panicked. She tried to pivot, claiming that our parents had given her the money willingly to invest in the foundation, that it was a tax strategy, and that I was twisting the narrative because I was jealous of her success. She practically begged her husband to believe her. I reached into my own folder and pulled out the fake, forged bank statements she had been giving our parents. I tossed them onto the coffee table. I explained that legitimate financial managers do not forge bank documents to hide missing funds from their elderly clients. Her husband picked up the fake statements. He recognized her handwriting on the sticky notes attached to them. He looked at her, his face completely devoid of emotion, and told her that he was done. He stated that he had spent years wondering how she afforded her lifestyle on the budget they had, and that he had blindly believed her lies about her foundation's success. He told her she sickened him. He walked out the front door without looking back. My sister was hyperventilating. She turned her venom on me. She screamed that I had ruined her life over a stupid argument at a barbecue. She yelled that I was a vindictive monster. I stepped very close to her. I kept my voice incredibly quiet and steady. I told her that this had nothing to do with the barbecue. I told her that I knew she was the one who called Child Protective Services. I told her that she tried to have my son taken away with malicious lies, and that she crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I explained that I didn't ruin her life. Her own greed and cruelty ruined her life. I just brought the receipts. I then informed her that our parents' accounts were frozen, her power of attorney was revoked, and all this evidence had already been handed over to a detective at the local police precinct specializing in elder abuse. The color vanished from her face completely. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the sofa, staring blankly at the floor. The bravado, the arrogance, the perfectly curated facade, it all shattered into a million pieces. I told my aunt and uncle that the meeting was over. They practically ran out of the house, terrified of the fallout. I then turned to my sister, pointed at the door, and used the exact same words I used at the barbecue. I told her to leave my property immediately. She stood up, trembling, and walked out into the night. She had no car, as her husband had driven none, and she had to walk 3 miles to a gas station to call a cab. Final update. It has been roughly 10 weeks since that night in my living room, and the fallout has been catastrophic for her, just as I intended. The police investigation moved swiftly due to the overwhelming paper trail. My sister was arrested at her home 2 weeks after the confrontation. She was charged with multiple counts of felony elder abuse, wire fraud, and forgery. She spent 3 nights in county jail before a bail bondsman would agree to work with her, as her husband refused to post her bail. Speaking of her husband, he filed for divorce immediately. He was terrified that the state would come after his own assets to pay restitution to my parents, so he aggressively distanced himself from her. He kicked her out of the house, changed the locks, and filed for an emergency freeze on their joint assets. She is currently living in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, awaiting trial. Our parents are heartbroken, but they are healing. The state was able to seize the remaining funds in the charity's accounts, which recovered about a quarter of what she stole. My sister's husband also agreed to a private settlement with my parents, liquidating some of his own retirement assets to pay them back, in exchange for them not pursuing civil litigation against him directly. Between the seizures and the settlement, my parents recovered about 80% of their nest egg. They have moved past the denial and are now cooperating fully with the prosecution. They have cut all contact with her. As for the CPS case, I filed a formal police report regarding the false claim. While it is notoriously difficult to prove the identity of an anonymous caller, the detective working her fraud case found texts on her seized phone, complaining to a friend about my son, and stating that someone needed to teach me a lesson. The prosecutor is looking into adding a charge for filing a false police report, though they are currently focused on the more severe financial crimes. My son is doing wonderfully. He has completely forgotten about the incident at the barbecue. He is currently building a new, more complex robot for a state-level competition. He spends his weekends tinkering in the garage, safe, happy, and entirely unaware of the hurricane that passed over our family. I sit on my patio in the evenings, watching him work. Sometimes, I feel a fleeting moment of guilt for the sheer brutality of how I dismantled my sister's life. I tore her family apart, cost her her home, and ensured she will likely spend several years in a federal prison. I orchestrated her downfall with a cold, calculated ruthlessness that I didn't know I possessed. But then I remember the look of absolute terror in my son's eyes when she screamed at him. I remember the paralyzing fear of opening my door to state workers who had the power to take him away based on her malicious lies. And the guilt vanishes. I protected my child. I protected my parents. I excised a cancerous tumor from our family tree. My sister believed that her wealth and status made her untouchable, and she believed that my son's neurodivergence made him an easy target. She thought she could strike at my family and face no consequences. She had no idea what I was capable of. Now she knows, and she will have the next several years in a concrete cell to think about it. I have no regrets. The pacing of justice might be slow, but my pacing was perfect.